Thanks everyone for joining, for taking some time out of your day to cover this really exciting topic with us. So really quickly, my name is Gabe Schwartz. I've been at SitelogIQ for about 5 years where I lead strategic initiatives. I've been helping US organizations for the last 15 years at various companies focused on energy management, demand response, battery storage, solar, and electric vehicles. I originally started my career as a management consultant and have an MBA from UC Berkeley. So at SitelogIQ, we work with large fleet operators, real estate firms, and auto dealership groups across the US to help them rapidly modernize and decarbonize their facilities. We're basically three things. We're a turnkey engineering and construction contractor. We're a program manager for multi-year, multi-site technology rollouts. And we are also a consultant helping our clients plan, budget, and select the best fitting technology solutions. So if, relevant to today's topic, we've been deploying EV charging infrastructure for more than 4 years to the tune of thousands of ports across 30 plus states here in the US. Ryan?
Thanks, Gabe. Good morning and afternoon, everyone. I'm Ryan Monahan. I'm the Director of Business Development with Electrada. I've been with the company since the beginning of this year and have spent the last 5 years or so working in electrification, transportation, and transit. I also, like Gabe, originally hailed from the management consulting world. Electrada is an infrastructure developer that fully capitalizes, designs, builds, owns, and operates EV charging infrastructure at fleets as depots. We're currently spread across the United States and all 50 states with a kind of overarching North American presence. Our goal is to be the one-stop shop for all things fleet electrification on behalf of fleets on both the private commercial side and public transit. So very much looking forward to exploring some really interesting details around funding fleet electrification with everyone today.
Speaking of those details, here's what we're going to cover today. So we're really going to go through 3 areas. The topic of this webinar is about how to fund your fleet electrification strategy. And we're going to start with really making sure that we understand the business case, right? There are some substantial investments potentially required, and we want to really get into the thick of what is the reason and what are the total cost of ownership elements that everyone should be clear on before they get started on this kind of journey. The second piece is looking at the different fleet charging payment models and partners that can help you to be more successful in this strategy, especially when it comes to how do I pay for this. And then we're going to get into the things that we can do to reduce both the upfront costs of fleet electrification, as well as some of the ongoing costs, which is something that's a little bit more unique to the world of electric fleet vehicles. So that's what we're going to cover today, and then we'll do a recap at the end. All right. So for those of you who joined us the last time, quick repeat here, but just wanted to kind of ground everyone in what we covered in our first webinar in the series. So basically, we talked about what are the main drivers where fleet electrification is starting to hit a little bit of a tipping point. So in terms of the vehicles themselves, there's a lot more vehicles available that can handle more duty cycles and more use cases, and they all have improved battery range and cost sort of targets now. There are a number of government mechanisms in place, both to encourage and in some cases mandate or penalize people who are not moving towards electrifying part of their fleets. Ryan, could you maybe take us through the second 2 drivers?
Certainly. So there's also a number of rebates, grants, incentive programs that are at fleets' disposal from utilities, municipalities, states, and federal government. All of these are critical components of our ability to continue progressing on fleet electrification and providing the financial resources to push this ecosystem forward. And then lastly, there's also a number of innovative transaction models that have come into the scene over the last several years. So of course, this can range from everything from your standard self-financed electrification program where you're capitalizing everything yourself, you're managing all the OpEx yourself, to working with financial institutions and other traditional financing partners, to then kind of as a service type models, which manages all upfront capitalization, which manages the end-to-end ongoing operational costs, O&M, uptime of those assets and the performance of the same. So it's a really interesting time to be working in this space. There's so much that's changing. There are so many new models that are available to us, and we're going to dig into all of these components in our conversation today.
Thanks, Ryan. So yeah, as we've seen at SitelogIQ, we've talked to hundreds of companies and public sector organizations out there that are now looking at electrifying a portion of their fleet vehicles for all those reasons that we just discussed. There are still some challenges, and this is some of what we got into in the last webinar, which is basically, there's still some challenges with vehicle availability, lead times, things like that. We have internal coordination is a challenge at a lot of companies and organizations because there's a certain level of expertise required. Now, this is a new area for a lot of people. There may not be the bandwidth or the people that really have spent time in this space there. You're looking at things like making technology decisions, planning across a multi-year time horizon. And then of course there's the charging infrastructure itself, which is something that in the past a lot of fleet operators were relying on networks of gas stations and things like that are out there. Now this is something that fleet operators have to own and manage as well, or at least manage. And so all of these things come with some challenges. We're going to dive into the funding side of that today. Right. So we're going to start with a quick poll. Everyone in the audience should have seen a poll pop up on their screens. You can answer directly in the Zoom app, and we're just going to see where people in the audience's thoughts are on this issue, and we'll give it a minute for everyone to respond.
I think some interesting varying responses. Give everybody another second here. So it looks like currently about half of our audience thinks that electrical upgrades are the most expensive piece. We have a slightly close second with charging stations.
Right. So yeah, really interesting. I think that says a lot about the audience here. Certainly people who have been paying attention to this topic already. We can see here that the charging infrastructure, based on those top two responses, definitely at the front of people's minds. And and that's something that, whereas vehicles, there's decades of history of I can buy vehicles, I can lease vehicles, I can buy used vehicles, etc. But now charging stations, electrical upgrades, right? All of that, it's kind of a newer area, and it can come with a bit of a price tag. So that's well, we're definitely going to get into a little bit more of how to overcome that challenge. So I think just in terms of those four elements that everyone just responded to, I have a question, Ryan. Given your experience at Electrada, there are these various cost components. Some of that can be quite expensive. People are obviously nervous about electrical upgrades and what that's going to cost. Like, what are some of the ways that companies can approach these costs and still plan an effective program?
Yeah, it's a great question. And obviously, when we think about electrification, there's probably three overarching rubrics that we want to take into consideration, right? There's ROI on the investment in these new assets and this new charging infrastructure. There's the component of reliability, ensuring that this new type of fuel is going to be able to fuel your fleet the same as petroleum-based products have been for the last 70 plus years. And then there's of course the sustainability component, right? The ESG components that comes with the implementation of the two. From our perspective, really any conversation that has to do with thinking about strategic planning and determining where we electrify first, in what order, at what depots, what types of vehicles, all has to start with the reliability and the ROI piece. And once you get that in hand, then you kind of beget the ESG goals, mandates, whatever each organization has as part of their viewpoint on this. And from that perspective, for us, it's trying to get as close as possible to real TCO parity including the fuel, the infrastructure, and the vehicles with ICE or gasoline or diesel-based vehicles. And so when we think about strategic planning, it's looking at where the cost factors make the most sense. Where's the cost of labor, lower, and where there are more lower hanging fruit? Where's the cost of electricity lower? Where are their average daily mileage use cases where vehicles are going, 70 to 100 miles per day, typically, so you can spread that upfront cost and the infrastructure out across a broader range of vehicles and miles. And where are we having, bunches of vehicles that are operationally model year 10 plus years or older, so that we know we're going to have to swap them out anyways in the near future. And it makes sense to do so with kind of some technological upgrades. So strategic planning really comes down to taking this from a real hardcore economic business case approach first, finding a clear path to implementation, and then getting all of the benefits of the sustainability that derives from that afterwards. So great question. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Yeah, I think one of the things that we've advised with a lot of our clients is also, especially given that people are pretty concerned about the cost of these electrical upgrades, is, to really understand the driving patterns, as you mentioned, starting with low-hanging fruit. So beginning with vehicles that have long periods of downtime. So maybe vehicles that are idle overnight, right? Where you can put in, less infrastructure intensive electric chargers, and maybe not require such extensive electrical upgrades at a facility, as an example, or considering other ways to mitigate those electrical upgrades using other technologies that don't rely on the utility. So that could be like batteries, microgrids, things like that as well. So all these things can be addressed in the planning stage, and then also with like technical and finance solutions as well.
100%.
All right. So we mentioned in the intro that there's, this isn't just a cost, right? This is an investment. Ryan, maybe can you take us through some of the quantitative benefits here? Like what is the business case to move toward electrification of fleet vehicles?
Absolutely. So obviously, the transition to electrification is tricky in itself, right? We're dealing with new technology. There's new upfront costs that we're perhaps unfamiliar with when compared to purchasing diesel trucks and refueling diesel trucks, for example. But the good news is that there are also a number of real hardcore quantitative benefits, right? So if we think about miles per gallon, we see there's really high efficiency of this electron-based fuel when compared to all gas vehicles, typically 3 to 4 times more, comparing kind of at the apples to apples with the same makes and models. The savings per mile are also significant, right? So almost uniformly, the cost of electricity is cheaper than the cost of, say, diesel. And even when there are wide disparities, obviously the cost of gasoline or diesel in California is significantly greater than, say, North Carolina. The there's still a difference in the cost of electricity also between those regions, and the savings are still there between the two. And then, of course, we all know that EVs have fewer components, less complexity, less things that can go broke in the middle of the night with in terms of their performance. And so there's real maintenance savings, both in terms of the ongoing upkeep of vehicles, as well as the systems that are required to be in place to continue supporting those, inventory, labor, everything else. So there's a lot of really fantastic, easily numerical, quantifiable wins here. But there's also, I think, a number of qualitative improvements. So, Gabe, I'd love to hear the feedback that you've been hearing from your customers and being in the field as to what some of those have looked like today.
Yeah, you can't always put a number on everything. Here are some additional benefits that our clients see once they start bringing electric vehicles into their fleets. So there are fewer operational headaches, and what I mean by that are, an electric vehicle doesn't have a catalytic converter that's going to get stolen. There's less revenue loss due to downtime of vehicles. You don't have to overbuild your fleet as much because those vehicles are a little bit less likely to be out of commission, to have maintenance issues. As Ryan was saying, it's not just a dollar cost savings, but time and headaches as well. Getting ahead of regulations that are coming down the pipe. So a lot of these regulations are uncertain. Certainly there's certain parts of the country where they've been a little bit more proactive, but there are regulations forming in a lot of different places. Where they end up is anybody's guess. I'm not a policy expert, but the more progress you make and the more expertise you develop in running an electric fleet, the better you're able to mitigate some of the risks that could come with regulation in the future. And then of course, you can show progress in sustainability, show that to investors and other stakeholders. So a lot of other reasons besides just hard dollars to take a really good look and form a great plan for electrification.
And I'd also add on to that in today's day and age, we hear this so often from our fleet customers. There is a real shortage of quality drivers in the market. And as more and more EVs are being deployed across commercial and transit fleets, there is really impressive feedback from the drivers. They're not coming home smelling like diesel fumes at the end of the day. Their backs aren't worn out from the rumbling of the big diesel engine. It's a smoother drive. It's able to accelerate more, potentially safer conditions on the road. There's a lot of these hardcore intangibles that really improve the satisfaction. And so a lot of our customers are actually using the adoption of electrification as a tool to improve driver retention, loyalty, and satisfaction, which can be a real competitive differentiator in a market where there's just not enough drivers.
Yeah, really great point. All right, so we're gonna now run through our kind of 4-step process for figuring out the funding side of your electrification. So first, we're gonna walk through how you comprehensively quantify the benefits, right? You've got to build a business case with actual numbers. The second piece is we're going to help talk about different approaches and financing models that can apply to these projects, selecting the one that's right for your organization. The third piece is really subsidizing the costs. So there are various sources of funding that apply to electric vehicles that don't apply to combustion engines, and we want to make sure that you take advantage of all of that, both for vehicles as well as for the charging infrastructure, bring down those costs as much as possible. And then we're going to talk about how to optimize ongoing costs, which there's a much larger opportunity to do when electricity is your fuel versus gas and diesel. All right, one more poll question for everyone here.
Go ahead and share your answers there. These answers are they're varying today. It's fun to see the data kind of spiking up and down so quickly. This doesn't always happen. So it looks like just under 50% of the audience is saying to meet regulatory or mandate milestones. Second after that is to take advantage of incentives or tax credits.
Yeah, so it looks like people are kind of focused on first the stick, then the carrot, and then some longer term strategic benefits as well, which resonates with what we've been seeing in the market as well. I think there's always that doing something because you have to, and in a lot of ways, as frustrating as that can be in some cases, there's also some benefit because it maybe makes you move a little faster than you would have, and now you're developing expertise because of those regulatory schemes that maybe your competitors in other regions are not developing yet. So that'll put you ahead of the game a little bit. So, okay. I think on this slide, Ryan, if you can just kind of help us understand a little bit of how you do a total cost of ownership calculation.
Absolutely. So when we think about total cost of ownership, there's kind of two overarching components to this, right? You have everything that falls within the first bucket of upfront costs, all of the initial costs necessary to get your system just in place and up and running. And there's the second one, which is then your kind of ongoing operational costs. So kind of think of this as CapEx and OpEx. On the upfront side, obviously, we're still at a point in time in the evolution of this technology where typically on average across different makes and models, your EVs are a little bit more expensive than their gas or diesel component. This specifically becomes much more significant as you go higher up in in different classes of vehicles. You see this to the greatest extent, kind of class 7 and class 8 type vehicles. Also, currently with predominant pre-existing fueling networks in place, it doesn't really cost, fleets don't have to develop and build out very much new kind of gas fueling stations. They can utilize public networks. They typically already have some kind of fueling station on site if they have that privately located. Whereas in electrification, you obviously need to build out the infrastructure for that. So there is some additional upfront cost components here when we think about EVs versus ICE that are real and that we have to consider. On the other hand, there are additional rebates and incentives, like a lot of the members of the audience just mentioned here, that are available to us to capture, and that can bring down the total cost of ownership of both the vehicles and the infrastructure, which are not readily available for their ICE counterparts. Now, on the ongoing operational costs is where we really start to see a lot more of the advantages fall in the favor of electric vehicles, right? So we know, as we mentioned before, that the cost of fuel is significantly reduced comparing ICE versus or electricity versus gasoline or diesel. Same thing with maintenance. There's tend to be less costs impacted by downtime, breakage of parts, and we get the additional benefit of fuel credits, tax credits that can play into reducing the total cost of ownership. So if we kind of think about this from an overarching perspective, there's usually some initial upfront cost, which is greater on the electrification side, and then significantly reduced ongoing operational maintenance and uptime-based costs over time, which can have a real impact on the total comparative cost of ownership when we think about the full lifetime value of both the vehicles and the infrastructure. So, this is all the conceptual model. There is really nothing like real world examples, though. And Gabe, I know you have a couple of thoughts on this, so we'd love to kick it back to you to hear what you've seen in the market, real life, case example of fleets that have implemented this and comparing those different cost buckets.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thanks for giving us the formula. Let's dig into the numbers. So this is a real use case from one of our client scenarios, and this is just like let's kind of walk through what the scenario is. So we're really talking about this is a class 6 cargo truck. We're just going to focus on one vehicle just to keep it simple for today's example. This vehicle on average is traveling about 78 miles per day. Now on some days it can be higher than that. The electric truck in question has a range of 180 miles, and so so it's basically can go more than twice the average vehicle usage without needing to stop and recharge. And then this vehicle's in operation 260 days a year, so basically a Monday through Friday type of operation. And then for the purpose of this example, we're looking at an asset life of 7 years, 84 months. Just some notes on some of the assumptions. So these are real stats that are verified by the Department of Transportation and Energy. So the diesel truck in question here has an 8 mile per gallon city and highway mileage rating. The electric version of that same truck is 23 mpge, which I think many of you in the audience are familiar with. That's the mile per gallon equivalent when it comes to electricity for battery vehicles. And then fuel costs. This is a California-based vehicle. It's $5.36 per gallon of diesel. Now that fluctuates. I just took a look this morning. The best I could find anywhere near me was like 470 something, right? So these obviously numbers fluctuate up and down. And it uses some different assumptions about how that may change over the years. On the electric side, one thing to notice is 9.2 cents per kilowatt hour. Some people familiar with California electricity rates might be saying, wow, that's pretty cheap. Most utilities in California now offer specific rate programs that are just for electric vehicle charging. And if you manage charging to do it during off-peak hours and things like that, you can actually bring so that's a real modeled rate based on actual rate tariff in Southern California Edison. Depot basically means charging at home base, right? And then the 50 cent per kilowatt hour, obviously much higher for public. So assuming that there's some percentage of the time, in this case, based on the routing of this vehicle, we assumed it would be about 5% of the time. So pretty rare, like more of a exception basis where they would stop at a public charging station en route rather than coming back to home base to charge. But obviously that's more expensive. And then For maintenance, based on actual figures based that have been compiled by Atlas Public Policy, about 20 cents per mile for the diesel truck and about 14 cents per mile on the electric vehicle. That applies for the first 5 years, and then for both diesel and electric, it goes up a little bit after year 5. All right, so this is the result of the analysis. So what we did was we looked at 7-year total cost of ownership, Class 6 diesel versus EV. You can see across the top what the different colors represent. So I'll start with the vehicle price. So the vehicle price, the MSRP standard purchase price, $110,000 on the diesel version. The EV sticker price is a bit of a shocker, $250,000, so more than twice as expensive. But then if you look on the right, there are both the federal tax credit up to $40,000 plus. In California, through the HVIP program, there's an $85,000 voucher that applies here. That brings it up to about $125,000 off. So half off the purchase price. So now the EV is effectively costs $125 instead of $110 for the diesel. We move up now to electricity and fuel. And these are, by the way, these are nominal values. So we just added up the total dollars over 7 years. I'll talk about, cost of money and present value in just a moment. But over the 7 years, the diesel is going to basically rack up about $100,000 of fuel cost. The electric vehicle, without taking into account any fuel credits or grid revenues that you can use by like enrolling your chargers and demand response programs or things like that to support the grid, that's going to be $24,000. So right off the bat, it's a 75% savings on the cost of fuel. Now, if you look at the far right column, you'll see that it goes down even further to $5,500, and that is because there are fuel credits available in California for dispensing energy from a EV charging station that you own and operate. And then there are also the ability to bring in a little bit of extra money by enrolling those chargers in some kind of a demand response or grid support program. You can make a couple $100s a year from that for a charger like this. So that can, right there, you can see a huge advantage in that fuel cost. Moving through to maintenance, you can see it's not as stark of a discount, but $23,000 instead of $33,000 over the lifetime, the 7-year life of that vehicle. And then, of course, there's charging infrastructure. A lot of people expressed concern earlier in the webinar about the cost of electrical upgrades. In this specific case, to support one Class 6, which is a pretty big truck, with a big battery. I think it's a 200 kilowatt hour almost battery in this vehicle. This is only a level 2 charging station with very minimal electrical upgrades required at this facility. And the reason is because it's driving 78 miles per day. It's got an overnight downtime, and there's plenty of time actually for that vehicle to not only charge to full every night using a level 2, I don't call it a slow charger, but it's not a DC fast charger, right? But in addition, there's plenty of time not only to charge up overnight, but even to delay charging until after 9 p.m. when it's cheaper and still get that battery full by the next morning when business starts back up again. And then finally, one thing we wanted to note, in this case, it also models the resale value. And we do see that there's limited data on this because a lot of these electric trucks are newer in the market. But it is anticipated that the electric truck would have a slightly lower resale value at the end of 7 years if you were to sell this and acquire new vehicles. So that's about $6,000 in extra cost on the electric side. So the big takeaway here is if you look at the total cost, you're seeing about $70,000 in nominal. Well, if you take that to today's dollars, that's $54,000 in net present value savings from going through this electrification project. And that includes the cost of installing those chargers, the electrical work, and the ongoing cost of maintaining those charging stations as well. So of course, as Ryan took us through a moment ago, the upfront cost is about $25,000 higher all in for the electric vehicle and the charger and all of those components. But the annual operating cost is more than $14,000 lower starting in year 1. And so that's actually less than a 2-year payback on that added upfront investment. So we're going to go into steps, 2, 3, and 4 in the process here, but we wanted to kind of just start by making sure that everyone, can think about the various components and runs through this exercise before you actually start thinking about how to pay for the project and all those other decisions that need to be made down the line. So a lot of us do know that there's funding options available. Ryan, this is really your area of expertise. Can you help us understand the various options and categories?
Totally. So thanks, Gabe, for walking us through that. That's really helpful stuff. When we think about different ways to fund this electrification initiative, there's probably three big rubrics here. You've got your traditional out-of-pocket expense, right? So this is typically kind of a direct cash purchase for both the vehicles and the charging, the maintenance. This is, you fleet are managing everything end to end yourself. You're figuring out which vehicles to select with the OEM or with the dealer. You are, managing the contracting out for every individual component of the electrification infrastructure process, from contractors to engineers to electricians to O&M and maintenance on those and warranties. And then of course ensuring the ongoing maintenance of that. So that's probably the most traditional model. That's out of pocket, you're doing it yourself. The second one is now kind of the next iteration of that, right? That's your traditional financing. So you're working with with banks, financial institutions, perhaps your OEM partners or dealer partners to get loans on the vehicles and on the equipment itself. You might even do a lease program or payback period with the EVSC or the charging hardware manufacturer, and you're essentially paying a certain cost of capital. You're paying interest on these assets, both on the vehicle and the charging side over time. And then thirdly, we have kind of the latest iteration of this market, which is what we call charging as a service. So this typically entails full capitalization of the end-to-end charging infrastructure all up front. It typically includes the one-stop shop for everything that is charging infrastructure, from initial designs of the site to the build and construction and the engineering to the ongoing maintenance and upkeep of those assets. Typically in a charging as a service model, the providers have, because they have covered all the capitalization, they've provided all the upfront investment, they typically also in many cases own those or build them and then simply let the assets sit on the fleet's balance sheets, but then own and operate, or rather operate the electricity, manage electricity, take care of the uptime and the maintenance. And so in this, you basically take all the upfront capitalization, investment, all the ongoing O&M and upkeep of those assets, plus usually a fixed or flat rate of electricity over long-term contracts. That's all bundled up into one monthly subscription fee, which is typically billed to those fleet customers once their sites are operational. So each one of these has different components to it. When we think about ultimately who's covering what, it's relatively quite straightforward. In a direct purchase, the fleet is paying for the upfront costs and the ongoing operations of the same to ensure their uptime is solid. In a lease-based model, you've got someone else helping you with the upfront side of things, but you're responsible for the ongoing operational costs, FTEs and employee resource allocation and uptime of those assets. And then the CaaS, or charging as a service model, it's very much externalized to a third party who is both covering the upfront investment as well as the ongoing investment in O&M. And this is, for both fleets or on the commercial side as well as on the public transit side. And so each of these have their own pros and cons. There's no one-stop shop fix for any of them. I know, Gabe, you and SitelogIQ have had exposure to this working with different customers. So it'd be great if you could walk us through your perspective on kind of the different pros and cons associated with each.
Yeah, before I do that, one question from the audience, Ryan, I was just wondering, in the charging as a service model, understanding that it covers the chargers, the construction, the ongoing upkeep of those chargers, is there a way that any of that subscription model can also be used to offset the upfront cost of the vehicle or the risk of the vehicle itself?
It's a great question. Something that we are doing in Electrada, which is a new component of our CaaS model, is incorporating the electric vehicle battery into that bundled EV charging infrastructure solution. So we are financially decoupling the value of the battery, which depending on the make and model of the vehicle can be anywhere from $80,000 to $100,000+. We're able to then wrap that into the EV charging as a service infrastructure model, amortize that over a longer period of time because we can have second life applications for that battery as on-site storage, for example. And we're taking it because we understand how batteries work for us. Any vehicle is just a battery on four wheels. We know how to optimize the performance through the charging infrastructure that we manage. And so we're taking a position on a higher value of that battery, of the residual value of that battery, which is typically greater than what you'll see from the OEMs or the dealers or what the fleets would assign themselves. So in doing so, we're able to reduce kind of the purchase price of the vehicle by 80 or 90 or plus K, reduce the total annual cost of ownership of that vehicle by 6,000 to 8,000 per vehicle per year. And that's kind of what we're doing to help out on the demand side of things with the vehicles, get them closer to parity to help kind of push things forward in conjunction with the charging costs of all the infrastructure. It's a great question.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting. And if you sort of defray the upfront cost of the battery and you're also wrapping in, the charging infrastructure, you've now sort of taken out the things that are more expensive upfront when choosing an electric vehicle. And now it just kind of looks apples to apples with a standard, vehicle decision for a fleet operator. So that's pretty exciting. So I'm gonna speak through on the pros and cons. I mean, a lot of it really comes down to in the direct purchase model, you maintain ownership and control. There's no potential balance sheet impact. So your CFO may prefer this versus, taking on a lease or some kind of liability on the balance sheet, things like that. And then of course, if there's a nice, attractive financial ROI for that, you get to keep all of that yourself in the direct purchase model, right? Moving through over to lease, like, in the lease model, or loan, you're paying financing costs, so there's a disadvantage there. And this typically will show up on the balance sheet as a liability. In the charging as a service model, I think what's the pros that are really interesting about it are that it takes the whole responsibility for upkeep, maintenance, potential costs of keeping those chargers online out of your purview, and then and you can negotiate with various, with the charging as a service provider. What is the response time? What's the service level agreement, right? Things like that. And this also, as Ryan was just explaining, even with or without including the vehicle battery in here, it can help to, take some of that higher upfront cost for putting in charging infrastructure and move it over to the operating costs where the electric vehicles have a huge advantage anyway, and make this a more palatable project for many organizations.
That's right. So, with that being said, we tend to think about partnerships having like really core characteristics when you think about a core funding partner and provider. And so we have kind of a brief checklist of things that we like to go through to ensure that as fleets are looking for some support on the charging infrastructure, they really understand what this looks like. So the number one is you want to make sure that every one of your depots or sites are being treated on a customized singular basis. That means you should probably have a flat and individual per kilowatt hour rate per site. So you want to ensure that your partner is treating each site essentially as a micro utility and is understanding what the particular conditions of each site are like, so that you're not just getting some kind of blanket cost that's going to balloon your cost structure. The second is that these are long-term partnerships. Infrastructure technology is a long-term game. These investment in infrastructure usually doesn't pay off until the long term, and you want to ensure that the operations of the same are of the highest reliability. So you want to look for partners that are able to commit to multi-year commitments with the highest level of reliability. Think 99% uptime guarantees. And you also want to ensure that they are kind of covering all components of the end-to-end process. So, if they're just taking on part of the O&M, or if they're just taking on part of the construction, ultimately what they'll be doing is they'll be farming out, or you will be farming out all the different contractor work to different agencies and organizations who are going to be margin stacking at each component of the process. If you have one partner who can provide the full end-to-end solution from design through engineering, through construction, through O&M and maintenance, then you can ensure they're probably taking advantage of kind of economies of scale with lower cost profiles and higher efficiency of your spend, which is really all about CapEx optimization. And then finally, you want to think through how to manage your electricity in the most efficient way possible and in the most cost-effective way possible. And so what a good CAS provider or funding partner should be able to do is be able to lock in a fixed rate of electricity over these long-term contracts. So it de-risks for you any volatility in the price of energy over time. We see that in California, for example, tends to be 7 or 8% increase in electricity year over year. There's going to be a lot of other states following suit. So if you can find a way to kind of take on or remove that risk from the equation, you're going to ensure that you've got a more visibility into your own budgeting and planning moving forward. So those are really the biggest things that are really critical for partners to be considering as they are moving forward and looking into electrifying their fleets.
Thanks, Ryan. So after you select the transaction model that makes the most sense for your business, the next thing is to try to bring down the cost as much as possible, taking advantage of the incentives that are out there. So the first one is tax credits. And as I mentioned before, there's a federal tax credit that was part of the Inflation Reduction Act that, depending on the class of vehicle, will determine up to a $40,000 tax credit. There are state programs as well. Sometimes they're tax credits, sometimes they're vouchers. There's also money distributed through most of the electric utilities. They're very interested in this idea of electrification because now the fuel is coming from them instead of from the gas industry, oil and gas industry, right? And so there are lots of incentives out there that they manage that can help at a minimum offset the cost of chargers, electrical upgrades, things like that. And then the third is, local, state, and federal grants. So one really good example of this is at a very localized level, in major port cities, there's a lot of concern around the amount of pollution that's coming into communities that live near the ports, and there's these trucks constantly going in and out every day. There's some great grant programs set up to try to encourage more electrification, specifically for what are called drayage vehicles that are just doing like short haul runs between the port and local distribution. And then Ryan, there's also this fuel credits. Maybe you can help explain a little bit more about how that takes form.
That's right. So there's different credit programs. There's different carbon credit programs. There's in California and Pacific Northwest, LCFS is what they call, which allow us to take advantage of the benefits of the sustainability impact of these electrification programs that can be then used to offset some of the cost of the electrification projects themselves. And so as we think about kind of each one of these, they all have, they're all necessary, right? They're all part of the equation of getting the ecosystem to electrify on a sustainable and cost-effective basis. So I think, a couple of considerations here. We won't dig into all of this. Is obviously a lot, and everyone can process this, following the webinar. But if we just look at, utility charger programs or infrastructure programs, these are all critical programs that are helping us to progress with electrification. There are a couple of things that fleet should probably take into consideration depending on the urgency of their timescales in getting to market and getting operational with their systems. So if they're looking at to deploy a utility infrastructure program at kind of a behind the meter installation, there are different components that impact your operational timeline, right? So in this case, the utility will typically determine how much it should cost and approve any designs associated with the cost of an infrastructure update or improvement to your local depot. There's usually not a ton of visibility into what that approval timeline looks like or when you can expect the project to be completed. So if you're kind of against the gun for compliance reasons, then there's not a lot of clarity into that. And there's also, usually a component in which there is a cost estimate associated with the ahead of the meter upgrades on the grid itself that are required, which are then often deducted from the ultimate cost of the behind the meter upgrades. And so there's a little bit less visibility into that, how those costs are determined and what that looks like. So these are all, again, critical components, which altogether between federal tax credits and state programs, carbon credit programs, and the utility and municipality programs are all pushing us forward in the right direction. However, there's also quite a few number of considerations that fleets should be thinking about quite proactively when determining which one of these to apply and how that's going to impact their operational timelines.
Thanks, Ryan.
So with that being said, it'd be great to understand a little bit more, Gabe, kind of what optimizing these fuel costs look like, above and beyond even what some of these incentive programs can support.
Yeah, so once you've taken in some of that free money that's out there in the marketplace, making sure to pay attention to those considerations that Ryan went through, then it's really looking at, okay, over the next several years, as I'm fueling these vehicles with electrons, right? How do I actually make that electricity price as low as possible, right? And so in the electric markets, in the world of energy management, there's really three ways to save on electricity costs. So the first is to buy electricity at the right time, right? So unlike gas, electricity prices do fluctuate in many areas of the country throughout the day, and that's because it may cost more or less to produce that electricity at those times. You can make your own electricity or make part of your own electricity needed at your site, which is something that a lot of companies have been doing and adopting over the years. And then you can offer support services to the grid. So basically you can say to the grid, hey, I can actually notch down my charging or turn it off for a little while if the grid is strained at certain times, and you can receive money for that. So these are important things to do once you put charging stations at your facility to make sure that you're not overpaying for your power. I think there's also some tools that allow you to do these things that, Ryan, if you could kind of walk through quickly, that'd be helpful.
Totally. So, you mentioned buying electricity at the right time. One of the best ways to ensure you're doing this in a very automated way is using what we call CMS, or charging management software, or energy management software. So these are typically software programs that should be automatically integrated with your charging hardware and the overarching EV infrastructure systems. Those can also then connect with what we call on-site generation or storage. So on-site generation being solar that's actually generating power on-site from your own location, or then from the power that you're able to capture from the grid, or from solar, storing that power on site in the battery, which you can then dispense out if you have to charge at peak times. For example, at 7 p.m. in California, then you can use your on-site battery to provide that power instead of having to tap into the grid at a higher cost of electricity. Finally, again, talking about long-term contracts and having a fixed price of energy, so you can have a flat rate over 5, 7, 10+ years to de-risk any volatility in the price of energy. And then being able to kind of, as we mentioned before, decouple the value of the battery on the electric vehicle itself, wrap that into a charging infrastructure program at a lower rate of annual total cost of ownership. It's another great way to really tangentially and cost optimize everything you're spending on infrastructure.
All right, so before I launch into a quick recap here, we want to leave some time for Q&A. So if you've got questions about anything that we've covered so far, or anything that's on your mind on this topic, please do put them in the Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom panel, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can during the time remaining before we wrap up here. So just to recap what we covered today. So first start by quantifying the benefits, build a real quantitative business case. So you want to analyze the total cost of ownership of, the electric vehicle you're considering, and then what you would do instead if you were not acquiring that vehicle. And then you want to make sure that you calculate a real net present value and IRR, so you understand what the return on this investment is, and that'll help to, gain support internally within the organization, and also help to make decisions about what is worth paying extra for, or whether you want to fund it yourself, etc. And then that total cost of ownership calculation will also help you prioritize the best vehicles or the best sites in your fleet operations portfolio, so to speak, so that you can start with the the most obvious sort of best returns, right? Got to get some points on the board, score some wins, and then move on from there. And I think that's a good recipe for success. When it comes to selecting a project approach, I think the key takeaways here are gauge your own internal team capabilities and your risk appetite, and that will help point you in the direction of whether you want to directly own and operate charging infrastructure, whether you want to explore charging as a service or other financing models, and then make sure that you're comparing multiple financing models and partners, and not just choosing them only based on financial criteria, but who's going to be the best long-term partner, and then also thinking about how they perform in various scenarios, right? Like what happens if electricity rates go up sharply, or what happens if financing rates go up or down, things like that, right? To make sure that you're aware of how these options actually compare to one another in real world scenarios. So when it comes to subsidizing the costs, one of the takeaways is that it is incredibly complex. You saw there are lots of different programs out there to fund them. Sometimes they run through the government, sometimes they run through utilities, local grants, other organizations. You want to make sure that you're identifying programs that are both that are your project is eligible for, but also projects that are sort of where the juice is worth the squeeze, right? Where they're attractive enough to make sense for whatever the trade-offs are in terms of length of time that it may take, or other control or decisions you may need to adjust if you're going to take advantage of that money. And of course, just read the fine print, right? All free money sounds good at first, and we obviously recommend taking advantage of as much of it as you can, but not all of it will make sense for your business or your project. And then once you have electric vehicles and you're charging them on site, make sure that you are doing things to optimize those ongoing costs. The first piece, of course, is charging on site as much as possible versus public charging infrastructure, because that's going to be less expensive. Take steps in the ways that we describe to lower your electricity costs. Charging at the right time, use software, manage charging, battery storage, other things to all of the tools in the toolbox to try to lower those electricity costs. And then finally, make sure that you're staying on top of the latest tools and technologies for bringing down those ongoing costs of electricity, so that you make sure that you actually realize the ROI that you calculated in step one.
Okay, so we do have some questions that have come in from the audience, and please don't be shy. Feel free to continue asking, and we'll try to get to as many as we can with the time remaining. Quick question related to incentives that we went through. Have you or Ryan ever seen a project kind of change course based off of the specific incentive that the client was applying for?
I can start, Gabe. Certainly feel free to add your thoughts as well. What we've seen is more conversations around the front end. So if we have certain customers that are looking at applying for certain incentive programs, and we help to educate them on what the impacts of the timelines and the operational impacts of those programs will be, then they've sometimes changed course. So for certain examples, maybe the actual benefit of the cost of an additional 50 to 100 grand or so in infrastructure reductions may not be worth it for a customer whose timeline may be pushed back by 6 to 12 months because of the requirements associated with the implementation of that. They also kind of lose, in many cases, control of the selection of hardware or infrastructure or materials to use, which for certain programs may be stipulated by the entity managing those programs. So we've seen it more kind of the impacts happening on the front end where they're considering different programs. We get an engaging conversation around what makes the most sense. Oftentimes they continue with those programs and get some great benefits from them. Other times they decide to go in a different direction.
Yeah, so just to add to that, let me track back to one of the polls earlier where people were concerned that the most expensive aspect of fleet electrification may be the electrical upgrades required. So if your fleet operations scenario requires fast charging, or you need lots and lots of chargers at your facility, and of course the facility wasn't built to necessarily handle that level of electric infrastructure, then those costs can be significant, certainly more significant than what we showed in our TCO example earlier. And that may make something like a utility incentive to help fund that infrastructure really, really important to the ROI of your particular project. In those cases, it's I would say fairly important to figure out what those incentives are very early on in your planning cycle, and get into the details of exactly how you take advantage of that, how long it's likely to take. I mean, we've seen some programs, not going to name any names, that are north of 24 months sometimes to get the whole project sort of designed, approved, and the money to come in. And so, if you've ordered a vehicle and the lead time is 18 months from now, you could be 6 months behind already if you need infrastructure incentives in order to make your project viable.
Great points.
How about when it comes to issues or hangups in the incentive application process? Can you provide some examples of issues that you've seen companies maybe run into, or maybe issues that have slowed down the approval process?
You want to take that one, Gabe?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple things. And sorry, Shannon, just to clarify, is that the internal decision approval process within the company, or?
Yeah, based on the question, I think that's fair to assume.
Okay. So yeah, I think one of the things that we've seen is that people get pretty far down the road with sort of an initial vision in mind. Hey, we're gonna get these couple of electric vehicles and incorporate them into our fleet operation, and we think we need a couple chargers. And I've been talking to 20 different charger manufacturer vendors, right? And they're all telling me sort of different things. And what we recommend is like, try not to put the cart before the horse. We really want to start with a good planning process up front, where you're doing an analysis, like which vehicles in the fleet, when are they going to electrify, right? It might just be 1 or 2 vehicles early on, but then are there going to be other vehicles 2 years later? Like, what are the cycles? Once you understand that, there are a lot of ways to better quantify that business case up front, socialize that internally within the company, so it doesn't come to a decision maker later in the process. They're like, whoa, like, why are we spending all this money, right? Having researched and being able to present very clear side-by-side comparisons of, hey, if we pay for this ourselves, this is what the cash flow looks like. If we go through a charging as a service offering, this is what the cash flow looks like. And having done that vetting up front, I think making those decisions early on, that will affect the scope of the project, so that you're not going to see a lot of like design changes or last minute diligence questions or things that can interrupt the flow of a project that may be operating on a pretty urgent timeline at that point.
I would also add to that you really want to approach this from the optics of like optimizing for just the right amount of infrastructure while future-proofing for your future scale and optimizing your electricity. So when you're trying to do that optimization, on the one hand, you don't want to have to build and dig out trenching and do construction twice if you know you're going to be adding more vehicles to your fleet at your site in the next 3 years. 70% of any project is labor, engineering, construction, design. And so you want to capitalize on that one time. And if you are just engaging on your own with a number of different types of contractors, electrical, hardware manufacturers, software providers, then the likelihood is that they're simply going to do whatever you tell them to do, like what you think you need. And then the utility will do exactly what results from that interaction. So if you talk to an electrical contractor and say, I think I need 20 fast chargers, and say, great, here's designs for 20 fast chargers. You send that to utility, you say, great, that'll be a couple megawatts of power. Congrats, you'll have your site operational in 36 months. That's not optimizing for cost or for efficiency. And so you want to really try and go into these processes with those optics in perspective as your key priority, I think.
Great. Well, we are right at time. If your question wasn't answered, or if anything else comes to mind, maybe when you're watching the recording or thinking about funding later on in the day, don't hesitate to reach out. We'd love to continue the conversation. And we'd also love to see everybody back here for our third and final part of our webinar series. We'll be joining our partners at Rexel Energy Solutions on November 12th. And to kind of wrap up our entire series, we started with creating that strategy. Today we talked about funding it. And then our third and final part will be implementing it. So we'll send out details over the next few days, and we hope to see everyone back here again. And we thank you for your time today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.